Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Scott Samuelson and I'm a professor of philosophy at Kirkwood Community College on the Iowa City campus. A year ago, in the heat of the campaign, the National Review, a main voice of American conservatism, did something unique. The editors decided that the leading Republican candidate needed to be stopped. They called Donald Trump, quote, a menace to American conservatism, who would take the work of generations and trample it underfoot in behalf of a populism as heedless and crude as the Donald himself. Well, now Trump is president of the United States, and Republicans control both the House and the Senate, as well as an overwhelming majority of state governments. What moral and political principles does the Republican Party stand for? Was the National Review wrong to say that Trump is a menace to American conservatism? Has Trump changed the face of the GOP? What are the commitments of those who lead our country, and what should they be? Where is our country headed under Republican leadership? We have a superb panel today to discuss conservatism in a Trump presidency. To my left is Derek Buckaloo, a professor of history at Coe College. Derek, thanks for being on.
Good morning, thank you.
We have Laura Kamienski, a co-chair at the Lynn County Republican Party. Laura, thank you for being on.
Thank you.
And at the end, Jim Leach, who's at the University of Iowa and who, of course, was a longtime Republican congressman from Iowa. Jim, thank you so much for being on.
Glad to be with you.
Well, Jim, maybe we can start with you. Has Trump changed the face of the Republican Party?
Well, certainly in the short term he has, and made it a somewhat populist party. It changed the constituencies who voted for president. Whether this is long term, nobody knows. But it's a reflection of a trend that's been long existent. It used to be philosophy was the heart of both political parties. Today it's more issues, and there are issues that to some degree people are looking for how you get the most votes rather than how you historically stood as an individual or as a party. And Trump was elected with a somewhat confusing group of issues in terms of consistency, but he proved as a personality to be stronger than anyone suspected.
So in a way you're saying it's like we've started to step a little bit beyond ideological commitments into a more scrambled political environment of issues and constituencies.
Well, it's true in both political parties. I mean, some aspects of politics, a liberal and a conservative are the same, and some aspects of politics are radically different. And the more complicated society is, the more issues there are, and it's inconceivable that an individual citizen can say they agree with everything the Democratic Party stands for or everything the Republican Party stands for, and so you kind of pick and choose.
Yeah. Well, Laura, let's bring you in on this too. So, why was there such vehement opposition to Trump by stalwarts of the party, as in the famous National Review piece? And were they wrong to think that Trump was changing the direction of the party, or were they right and that Trump really has sort of put a new stamp on what republicanism is all about?
I think there's a little bit of yes and no to that question. If you wanted to start talking about ideological purity or I don't know what the test for that would be in the Republican Party. We have pro-life, pro-choice members of the party. Any issue, there are certainly divides within the party. I think, National Review, what they do is they're a conservative magazine, so they're much more concerned about the philosophy of things. But at my conservative debating society in law school, we always had a member who would regularly stand up and, as part of his speeches, say, politics is the art of the possible. So you have that much more pragmatic approach, and I think pragmatic would certainly be a good word to describe the Trump campaign.
I would also just add to that. First of all, National Review, of course, founded by William F. Buckley, was always a very intellectual publication. It was very much about ideas, and in as much as, and we could talk about whether this was particular to Trump or kind of the moment we're at, ideas or sort of policies being spelled out as part of a campaign doesn't seem to be nearly as important as, again, packing the building and getting the reactions you want and that kind of thing. And so just to use the example of Donald Trump, he said a lot of different things at a lot of different moments. He said a lot of things that seemed that they would fell his campaign at various moments, and they didn't. And of course, when it came down to what are his policies, the famously wonkish Hillary Clinton had lots of things on her website, but there wasn't much meat on the bone in terms of policy with Donald Trump. And so it's not surprising that the National Review would have problems with that, given its background in the conservative movement. I also think there's a difference between campaigns and governance. And I think what is going to be interesting for those who voted for Donald Trump is to kind of keep an eye on what happens here, not to be, pedantically consistent, but for example, to make a big deal out of Goldman Sachs in relation to either Ted Cruz or Hillary Clinton during the campaign, but then to bring in a lot of Goldman Sachs executives into your cabinet. There's some issues in terms of exactly what Donald Trump will do now that he is in office.
Well, right, and I guess that's kind of my worry, is that I agree with Laura that on the one hand, there's the sort of philosophical ideology of a party or a group, and then on the other hand, there's a question of politics making that possible and the art of the possible. And those who are so rigidly ideological, who refuse to compromise, that seems to be a problem. But I guess maybe just it's the philosopher in me, but I want to stand up for the idea of having ideas and having something like a sense of values guiding you. One doesn't want to be a pragmatist who's just randomly grabbing at whatever. The idea is that you have certain core principles and other things that you would like, and that you're trying to work towards those, and maybe you're willing to make compromises. So I guess my question is, what does the Republican Party stand for now? What are those core principles? Obviously, it's a diverse coalition, and there are, people have different things that are important to them, but are there some, bedrock things that you can say, this is what the Republican Party is going to be trying to do, particularly now that they have such power over national politics as well as state politics?
I would say probably one of the biggest, most basic principles would be that, the traditional government of the people, by the people, that government closest to the people is the one that should be doing the most for them, that the basic conservative principle of the federal government should be staying out of our local schools and taking as little of our tax money as possible. Yes, we need a federal government to handle national defense, but why is the federal government, taking that ever-increasing portion of my paycheck every 2 weeks? So those
So a commitment to small
things,
government, essentially,
small
is still
government,
going to be
local
crucial.
government, local control. I think those fundamental bedrock principles are definitely still there for the Republican Party.
Does that, Jim, do you think that that still is a kind of fundamental principle?
Well, that's a part of it. Then you have these conflicting aspects of national security, and most Republicans want a strong military, but not all Republicans are for an active interventionist military. And so these are judgment calls. Now, Mr. Trump ran as a candidate suggesting that he'd oppose the Iraq war from the beginning. Whether he did or not is a little unclear, but he argued that.
And he did stand up for it in the debates, that he thought the Iraq war was a disaster.
And now, upon assuming office, he appears to be a little bit more interventionist than might have been suspected. And so he's looking at a little different philosophical basis. But the one thing he has consistent with all recent presidents of both parties, he is really intent on trying to bring some sort of settlement to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Now, frankly, this was Barack Obama's #1 priority, and he didn't manage it. And so Mr. Trump appears to say, well, if it didn't work in the Barack Obamian way, maybe it'll work in the Trumpian way. And we'll all have to watch.
And I'm not sure what the Trumpian way is in regard to that, Jim. Originally, he said, the United States can hardly be an honest broker in the Middle East because it's favored Israel far too much. But of course, there are some very important Israeli funders to the Republican Party in Nevada, for example, and he tended to move in the other direction, and then, of course, told Netanyahu, help's on the way, hold out, and when I come into office, we'll be in a different position. Even since he came into office, the original statement on settlements was lukewarm, even from the perspective of Republican statements on this issue. But then he seemed to say that actually settlements could be a problem with peace. So I'm not even sure exactly where he's headed on that particular issue. The other thing I'd say about the principle that Laura brought up, and I think it's a valid principle, a defensible one, but there is an element of that diverse Republican coalition that is actually quite interested in having government intervene in the lives of Americans, and that often has to do with social conservative ideas about abortion or access to birth control or various things, and famously that's been an issue for the party in the last few years.
Sure has.
It seemed to be an issue for the Trump campaign, although obviously even some very embarrassing things didn't seem to fell him. Although the point that should be made about living in Trump's America is it was a very near thing in November. Famously, of course, he lost the popular vote. That's not how we choose presidents. But it was 77,000 votes in 3 states that swung it. So it's very possible that that entire campaign could have unfolded. A few people stay home here,
Sure.
a few people come out to vote there, and Hillary Clinton is the president.
Right.
That's obviously a parallel universe that we're not in.
Right.
There are lots of things to grapple with here in terms of what Trump wants. I think Trump was interested in competing in what he saw as the world's biggest reality show in certain ways. I think he enjoys addressing groups of people. I think he enjoys doing that. I'm not sure how much he's enjoying being the president at this point.
I think
that's a real question.
No, he likes division. But one of the interesting phenomena has nothing to do with philosophy, and has to do with personality. And what really united the Republican Party this year was lack of confidence in the Democratic candidate, and what really united the Democratic Party was lack of confidence in Trump.
Yeah.
And so both parties were united by opposition to the opponent.
Right.
And that was a truly seminal part of this election that everyone has kind of missed.
With historically high negative ratings for both candidates.
That's true.
On a broad scale.
Yeah.
So that's certainly part of it too.
Yeah, okay, I think that seems exactly right. At the same time, though, like I said, I'm curious about trying to get back to is there something guiding people? And so I wanted to return to the small government issue just briefly here. I think the foreign policy stuff is important as well, but with the terms of the small government stuff, I mean, at least part of what Trump seems to have stood for in the campaign was kind of huge infrastructure spending, I take it, by the federal government. Is that the kind of, I mean, at first that seemed like something a traditional conservative would be at least a little bit nervous about overall, that doesn't seem like to use the kind of philosophy you were articulating, that doesn't quite seem like the place of the federal government to do that. And if it is, then we have to be very cautious about not doing it in a fiscally irresponsible way, et cetera. It seems as if Trump is pushing towards that direction, though we'll see if anything materializes.
Haven't heard anything in these first few weeks about it.
Right.
One of the suspicions is that that's part of what's going to fall by the boards. And as I said, I think there's a real case to be made to think about the campaign versus what's going to happen over the next 4 years. And I know we're going to talk about the Republican Congress and kind of how they're relating to Trump, I think, as part of what we talk about tonight. But this coalition, in simple terms, has always included, since the '60s, the sort of libertarian economic conservatism, right? Corporations, minimum regulation, low taxes, those kinds of things, and then kind of a social conservatism. Part of it responding to the '60s, and part of it, of course, responding ultimately to evangelical or fundamentalist Christians entering the political realm in the late '70s. Trump, leaned much harder toward kind of those rank and file, nationalist, conservative cultural questions.
Right.
But of course he did so as a billionaire, or we're told he's a billionaire, with of course lots of connections in New York with other rich people. Exactly what he's going to do now that he's in government. I think part of what the Republicans in Congress are trying to see what they can do is whether they can get through tax cuts, some regulation changes, and those kinds of things. They're interested in those things.
Right.
But for Trump voters in small towns in eastern Iowa or southwestern Wisconsin, whether any of this is going to make America, let alone their community, great again, I think is an open question.
And Jim, maybe I can ask you this directly. I mean, it long seemed a kind of bedrock principle of the GOP that the free market was a kind of fundamental good, that it in the long run lifted all boats and promoted a kind of good character. And while perhaps there had to be some regulations and some, safety net, overall the dominant note in the market should be freedom, which allowed, which sort of made it seem to me very shocking when the Republicans went against TPP and Trump sort of argued for a pretty robust protectionism that seemed to go against some of that basic fundamental belief in the free market. So where do you see the Republican Party standing when it comes to issues of free trade and free markets?
We may see the Congress and the presidency at some odds in this. Now, Republican history is inconsistent. I mean, in the late 19th and early 20th century, it was a very protectionist party. Then you had an interventionism of an active government nature by Teddy Roosevelt,
Right.
which was breaking up the trusts.
Right.
And I consider that to be a very free market principle.
Yeah.
The trade agreement Trump equated to earlier trade agreements, and one of the ironies is that this particular trade agreement that goes by your initials TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was probably the most pro-agricultural agreement for America that's ever been initiated because it forced all of the parties to accept American agricultural products, period. And it opened up agricultural markets. Now, one of the ironies is when we stepped away from it, China has tried to replace us and appears to be making great inroads.
Right.
And so we're going to have a TPP headed by China.
Right.
And so what was designed as being kind of an anti-China
Right. An Asian
agreement
pivot,
could end up being a profoundly pro-China event. And so you might have had a counterproductive circumstance with Trump using the language that people have used against other trade agreements,
Right.
against a trade agreement of a somewhat different nature.
Right. But I take it though, and I take your point 100% about TPP, but I take it that part of what Trump tapped into, as you said, was a frustration with trade agreements in the past, an idea that trade agreements have not served the American worker well, and we need to protect the American worker against global free market.
There's no doubt that is the perception, and there's no doubt that we had a candidate that was classically as anti-establishment as any candidate we've had in modern times, and that what you had was an establishment Democratic candidate in all regards except she was a she. And that was what was different
Right.
about the Democratic candidate.
Yeah.
But there was no one more establishmentarian than Hillary, and no one more anti-establishmentarian
Right.
than Mr. Trump,
Right.
and the country had enough. And basically we had a referendum on the establishment.
Right.
And he has made it very clear that he wants to be different. Even though in the past, most of his personal views seemed to be more aligned with the Democratic Party than they came to be aligned in this particular election.
Right. Well,
I'm sorry, can I just one observation?
Yeah.
About the history of this.
Yeah.
Jim talked about an establishment Democrat, and certainly Hillary was one of those. And he talked about being an anti-establishment candidate. Part of the reality is that this was a change election, quote unquote, and political scientists sometimes talk about these things in these terms. When a party has been in office for 8 years, particularly since the 60s, there's actually only one case where a third term
Right.
has come, and that was George H.W. Bush
Right.
in the wake of Ronald Reagan's 2 terms in office. That's the only time that either of these parties has held on to the presidency for 3 successive elections or 12 years. So it's very hard to do, and certainly Hillary associated herself very clearly with Barack Obama. It was going to be a third one of those. But you do have voters who voted for Obama twice, who then voted for Donald Trump, which does tell you there's something interesting happening here.
Well, and beyond that,
part of what that ends up happening with that is that the votes, as Jim said earlier, came from very different places.
That's true.
I mean, Orange County flipped to Hillary Clinton in 2016, the notoriously conservative Orange County, while of course many other voters who may have voted for Obama in 2008 ended up voting in 2016 for Donald Trump. So they're
Dubuque,
looking
Iowa,
for change.
voted for Donald
and
Trump.
Different things.
But more profoundly, this is the first election that college-educated people voted in majority for the Democratic candidate. And at the same time, Mr. Trump picked up a larger group of working America voting for him.
That's right.
But I guess, Laura, let me just ask you directly. I mean, is it the case that the Republican Party is still saying, look, okay, there's a lot of discontent, but we are going to continue to argue for the power of the free market, the global free market, or is that something that the Republicans are going to back away from and say, you know what, we need to rethink, we need a new model of the economy, the kind of old free market economics just no longer works in this new world?
I don't think we're backing away from the principle of free markets, but when you have countries with state-run industry, they're not competing at the same level as we are.
Well, I know, but the whole idea of the free market is that it's going to transform that over time, right?
And we're working on that, but in the meantime, we can't
The solution can't be that you just say, no, we're not going to have free markets with you. That seems like that's going to... I don't know. I thought the faith was that the free market was a transformative thing overall for the world and for the good.
Over time, but markets are very slow actors.
I see. So we need to back away from the free market.
Not back away, but maybe not just totally abandon our people. We need to still make sure American industries
Well, I know, but that sounds to me like
fairly.
what Democrats say, not what Republicans have said over time, that we need a strong social safety net, we need to back away from trade deals that don't help the American worker, et cetera, et cetera. Those seem to me things that have been a part of our political conversation, but we're on the left, not on the right. Now, I'm wondering if that's switched somehow, and you have Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama leaning towards things like TPP and the Republicans sort of backing away from free trade, global free trade overall.
Again, I don't think I would take too much across the board from TPP. It was a very different kind of trade agreement. Let's look at what he's saying about NAFTA.
Trump has been a protectionist about NAFTA, whatever.
He's
all
saying,
these things,
let's look at what's happening with NAFTA.
Right.
Is it really helping us the way we thought it was?
Well, what about? Let's switch one more time a little bit, because there's another big issue that I want to get to, which is, some have held, and this is both on the left and the right, that Trump threatens core aspects of our democratic system. That he trades in falsehoods, that he refuses to release his taxes, he praises Putin's style of leadership, he has rearranged the NSC, he attacks journalism, he attacks the judiciary. So in other words, some people have argued that this isn't just left-right stuff. This is about fundamental things that our country stands for. Is there anything to that charge that Trump just isn't just a slight ideological change, but represents at least some things that threaten the very nature of our system? And if that's true, then what is the duty of, say, the Republican Congress? If it's not true, obviously, then that's hyperbole that needs to be ignored. But I'm wondering if there's anything to this. There at least are some, to me, concerning things about what's going on.
I think this is more personality
than substance.
And he has a personality that he's comfortable with division, and he likes to create division, and it puts him front and center. And this is something we've never seen before of this magnitude.
Yeah.
And I think that's much more profound than the fact of a given issue or two that he's inconsistent with certain Republican historical principles.
Right.
Please go ahead.
You mentioned, attacking journalists or journalism.
journalism is not the same thing today in 2017 as it was in back in 2004 with the expansion of internet and social networking and cable news channels and all of that. And he said, I don't need you. I can play this game. And he tweets what he wants the American people to see.
Right.
So
there's also
the game's changing. It's not, is he undermining
I guess I'm a
it?
little nervous about the game changing to social media over news organizations reporting on the facts.
There's also a long history on the right of attacking, the so-called liberal media and these kinds of things. This goes back to Spiro Agnew. Rush Limbaugh is having a field day with this years before Fox News gets created, and so on and so forth. And you're absolutely right. Donald Trump's comfortable on Twitter. In some ways, again, his personality matches to kind of 140 characters of a shot on this. But you asked about the element of a threat here. I think there is some threat, although I think it's somewhat gratifying that at least in the near term, these institutions have been responsive, and are responding to how Donald Trump has operated at the beginning of his term. But the other thing I would say is that it's hardly conservative. When you start to suggest that the independent judiciary is not a co-equal branch of the federal government, when you attack the press in as much as freedom of speech is enshrined in the Bill of Rights, there are going to be conservatives, including conservative Republicans, that have serious problems with this. And you've heard some of that. People aren't, in open rebellion within the party, at least on, Capitol Hill at this point. But this is a real question, I think, for people who are honestly conservative about the U.S. system and their adherence to the Constitution and these kinds of things.
And so, Jim, I want to get your insight here. Do you think that Ryan and McConnell have a strategy for dealing with Trump? Do they have an agenda that they want to get through, and that they have a sense of how to work in this
No, I think this is going to be a
catch-as-catch-can
circumstance. But what is clear is that they're prepared to work with Trump and give him the benefit of the doubt if things seem to be working. And they're also totally prepared to cut ties if things do not work. And that was clear in the campaign, where there was a lot of thought they might totally walk away from Trump, and then they decided things were going all right and we were better off as a team. But the oath everybody in public life takes is to support and defend the Constitution. It's not a party loyalty test. It's a constitutional test. And if you go to philosophy, you have individual rights conservatism based on John Locke and his philosophical godson Thomas Jefferson, and then you have James Madison, who fits that tradition, and then you have Edmund Burke, who believed in you respect institutions.
Right.
And if you make an abrupt rupture with the institutions, and we have three major ones, the courts, the legislature, and the executive, you're going to have problems. Now, to the president's credit, he clearly has named a respectable candidate for the Supreme Court.
Right.
And that's of seminal significance. And he's made last week a very important international agenda issue, and that is he has re-embraced the foreign policy of the United States that began with Richard Nixon and through all Democratic and Republican presidents since on a one China policy. And this is a embrace that's designed to avert war. And is quite profound.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we have to cut it off here, even though I feel like there's so many more issues to get to, but I appreciate we end on this thing of our commitment to these fundamental institutions that we have. So I'd like to thank Jim, Laura, and Derek for a great conversation. We hope it's one that you continue in your homes. So thank you, and we'll see you next time on Ethical Perspectives on the News.